All good. Thanks for joining, and we'll start the session. Very excited about having you and about the sessions. Thanks everyone for taking the time. I know everyone's very busy, but this is very an exciting subject. I think for EU battery passport, digital passports, it's really a growing topic. I think it's been ignored for a little while, but that's at least on our side at Sourcemap. It's a topic we hear more and more. So excited to have this conversation. I'll do first some intros. The format is going to be a Q&A, me interviewing Paco, and at the end, we will also let the audience ask questions. So you can use the chat. We'll review all the questions, so feel free to ask them throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to address them. But first, let me do some introduction for this session. We'll have Paco Ribagnac, Vice President Intelligent Industry at Capgemini. Capgemini Invents. Thank you, Paco, for joining us. Paco has more than 15 years of experience working on supply chain transformation, sustainable value chain, and AI, and more recently also AI-driven transformation. So a lot of experience, a lot of expertise that I'm very excited to dig in and have a conversation. On my side, I'm Juliette Barré. I'm VP of Sales at Sourcemap. For the past 7 years, my expertise has really been around upstream traceability, supply chain due diligence. And so I'll be also sharing with you what we hear from the market, what we hear companies are doing now, or the questions they also have with our day-to-day at Sourcemap. All right, so maybe starting at the beginning, kind of the core due diligence obligation for EU battery regulation and its corresponding kind of battery passports, they were delayed to 2027. It was originally meant to be in 2025. 2027, it's still, I mean, in our experience with other regulations like EUDR, it will be here before we know it. And so to kick things off, I wanted to hear maybe from you, Paco, what are some of the basic due diligence requirements for the battery regulations that we know so far? So what do company needs to prepare for what we know so far?
Yes, thank you, and happy to join you today. So indeed, maybe let's go back to basics because that thing has been a little bit scary and moving, the deadlines, the content of the regulation itself. So to go back to basics, so the core obligations under the EU battery, they are designed to ensure a sustainable and transparent life cycle for batteries placed on EU market. Well, that's the core of the regulation. The most basic requirements they concern, it's very easy, it's due diligence, carbon footprint, and recycled content. If we take the first bit, and then we can deep dive regarding supply chain due diligence and focusing maybe on the critical raw material, it translates into an internal policy, meaning you need to have a clearly established policy to address social and environmental risk, which are aligned with international standards like OECD. Risk management in the sense that you need to have implemented systems to identify, assess, and mitigate impacts on human rights and or the environment in the supply chain. Traceability, so a chain of custody or traceability system for critical raw material, cobalt, lithium, nickel. Grievance mechanism, so have a mechanism for workers and affected communities to raise the complaints, and verification, so really the due diligence, periodically audited and verified by a third party. So that's the first bit on, let's say, supply chain due diligence. And that's already a lot because it's things that the industry was not accountable for the extended ecosystem before. So it's an extra responsibility for the companies. On top of that, on top of the due diligence, there are things related to sustainability and transparency obligations. So carbon footprint. Carbon footprint, so you need to calculate and declare the full life cycle carbon footprint for large batteries. Recycled content in terms of documenting and reporting this recycled content, and the battery passport itself, mandatory by Feb 27, which will be really the electronic record to make all this information accessible. So it seems a lot, and it's a lot but by the way, it can be limited to a regulatory checklist. It's an ecosystem topic. That's really the philosophy is to encourage actors along the value chain to collaborate, and it's the foundation for future circularity at scale.
Thank you. And I'd like to dive in the first part, which is the supply chain due diligence, because to your point, I think this is things that, especially that part that is kind of new for the industry to look at, or at least in a new way. Based on your experience, how aware are companies in scope are of EU batteries regarding kind of the different elements you highlighted, such as kind of the policy, the risk management, the traceability, the grievance mechanisms, and verification? Would you how aware of there? Is this something they're already working on, or is it still more at the beginning of trying to be educated? Yeah, you're muted, Paco, just so you know.
Indeed. When we started to work on that, it's fairly recent. It's 18 months ago that we really started. There were lots of questions on both the what and on the how. On the what, because let's be honest, it was not so clear initially in terms of regulatory expectations. And also on the how, because it requires new capabilities for the industry. And I'm sure you'll mention TRL mapping in a minute. And it raises questions on data architecture and referentials, which are tricky, and also on the role along the value chain, which in our case today is quite complex, with miners, refiners, traders, cell makers, pack makers. So heterogeneous level of really maturity on this topic, I would say.
No, that makes sense. And I think we're seeing similar things with the discussion with our current customers or with other companies we're talking to, especially because the implementation guidelines are not out and they will be out in 2026. And so I think we're seeing a lot of questions around what might change. What we've seen with similar regulation on a very different topic like EUDR is the implementation guidelines really helped finalize how company we're supposed to do it. But what we're still seeing, at least on with the discussion with our customers and others, is that we're seeing multiple kind of energy and electronic companies still very early in their journey. But what there are, and based on the requirements on supply chain due diligence, the first step they're taking is to start their mapping of their battery supply chain upstream, identifying all the sites from T1 to Tn, so all the intermediaries like you mentioned, the refiners, the traders, etc. They're leveraging technology like Sourcemap to also monitor the risk that you mentioned, whether it's around forced labor, environmental risk. And because, again, this is a part of their batteries that they know will be in the passport and have to be in the passport, and they rarely have visibility in this upstream part. And so that's really a lot of the preparation work we're seeing companies starting to do. And it may seem like a daunting task because sometimes our customers have hundreds, thousands of suppliers. And so if you add the upstream, you often add 10x, 20 more time upstream suppliers, but that's where really technology can really help because it can be fully automated. And I think for the companies that have started pretty early, what we're starting to see as well is they also see obviously the risk and the work that needs to be done for EU battery, but they're also starting to see opportunities within the first few weeks to really unlock a lot of discussions and potential for their sourcing strategy, such as building partnership with very resilient suppliers or suppliers that are, pretty advanced. And so the second step where we are taking is to utilize this mapping and risk data to implement risk strategies. This is not without, possible if you don't have reliable data. And so it sparks a lot of new conversation internally at our customers, as this gives them access to data, information, insight they did not have before. And so that's really where we come in at Sourcemap, is how can we provide the most reliable upstream supply chain data to our customers. But again, it's obviously for this preparation on EU battery passports, but what we're seeing is that it also unlocks a lot of operational opportunities as well for those companies to have stronger sourcing strategies, so more resilient supply chain. When we go to, again, back to the the EU battery passport, the digital product passports for other goods, it represents really a significant shift in consumer-facing traceability compared to what exists now or existed before. I guess question for you, Paco, what are some ways that a company can use that level of traceability to their advantage?
It's true that I think it's a bit more straightforward for digital product passport, let's say in mass consumer goods, because in the sense of an augmented consumer experience, it's much more easier to grasp. And actually, it has already started for quite a long time. And QR code on a product in a supermarket, scan to see where the olive oil is coming from, and etc. But that kind of augmented experience now is quite obvious. Um, but there are also, of course, business opportunities for battery passport, and there should be because if not, it will be like a null ROI kind of investment, and I think everybody hates to have pure investment without ROI. So that there are indeed use cases. Alors, so it's in terms of operational excellence, you mentioned it. Operational excellence beyond also with engineering. So accelerate battery R&D, optimize battery lifetime with analytics, advance coupling that with ML, and also in terms of new services, of course, even for battery auto. But it's less obvious to scan a QR code of the battery, but in terms of new services, for example, curative maintenance, eco driving tips to proactively push to the drivers, etc. So we start seeing banks of use case being shaped both for operational excellence and I would say also an augmented experience with the users to advise them. But it's still in shaping overall.
I think that's similar to what we've seen. I think on the passports, we have one of our luxury kind of case studies at Sourcemap where they could really use the passport as a way to differentiate themselves and feel much more confident or make their customers much more confident in where the products come from. So that's been used as a differentiator. I think on the auto OEMs, market or industry, what we're seeing as well is obviously the way to differentiate themselves in terms of having it or being the first to have it, but also how they can use the very large breadth of data that they're collecting for the passports to for operation excellence, for more supply better sourcing. So not just the output and doing it just because they have to, but and differentiating themselves, which is definitely a part of it. But also, how can they use that data on recyclability, on NTR mapping? How can you use that to drive stronger, more resilient business? We know, disruption for this kind of industry costs them very fast millions, and so that's I think one thing we've started to see, and so kind of numbers that I can share of one of our customers who had started this work to look at not only batteries but also other materials. But if we focus on battery, within 60 days they were able to locate the mines and refineries of their upstream supply chain, started to do the risk monitoring. They also looked at the volume to determine what's the most strategic sites that they have within their supply chain for batteries, and especially to ensure sufficient reserves and capacity of strategic suppliers, because battery is a big race. A lot of people want battery. We want to grow businesses. And so for them, that the ability to have mapped those suppliers, understand capacity, and enabled them to establish long-term sourcing contract with some of those end-tier suppliers for strategic metal, and help them also grow their business and more resilient in terms of capacity of what they can produce and have in their supply chain for batteries. So I think that was a very interesting use case for us of like, obviously there is a bit we have to do it because it's compliance, but it was very interesting to see how this was started by compliance, but was it leveraged by sourcing to grow their EV business. Again,
Absolutely.
I know
If
this.
I
Oh,
may,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, maybe there
No,
was,
no, no, go ahead.
if I may, me personally, I'm super happy and excited that now this type of solution, what you provide in terms of capabilities exists because I started my career, there was no, it was terra incognita, that part. It was internal value chain with DRP, DAPS, the WMS. We have brought this new type of solution to have a better understanding of the tier and value chain, help the mapping, collect information. At the beginning, people were a bit like, okay, what can we do with that? Now it's really accelerating. And we
Mm,
see uh, the most investment we see from companies are actually in the upstream part of the value chain for resilience and compliance reasons, building on what Sourcemap bring in terms of capabilities and adding on top of that analytical layers to build this use case and be very and that's so fitting so well with ML, Gen AI, agentic also tomorrow, what it can bring. It's really a gold mine beyond compliance. Really, it's important to repeat that. It's not just compliance. It's a gold mine for companies to find uh, margin protection use
mhm.
cases, to find revenue growth levers, etc. So it's again, it's less a constraint than an opportunity, I think.
Yes, and I
Small
think that's
parenthesis.
where in the journey of this EU battery, that's what we see is depending on who is leading these efforts internally at companies, there's a bit of education and helping them also educate their leadership. But I think you touched on the other points that I really want to dive in because which is data. Uh, as we know from other EUDR, EU regulation and directive, the details are often in the guidelines, which again, we've mentioned it earlier, will come in 2026. However, there's already some data point that companies we know should be collecting, and we've discussed some of them. And it's also very fast, a lot of data, and it can seem a little overwhelming. What data, where they are, what needs to be done. So, could you kind of share with the attendees and here kind of what are the data points that companies should be collecting now while they wait for the official guidelines to be published?
Yes. So that's the month we'll do the long checklist. So no, but there are two class. Let's start with basic. There are two categories of data: static one and dynamic one. Static, it's general information around unique battery ID, manufacturer details, etc. Battery, even like a weight, dimension, chemistry. It's something. It's obvious, but that's something you need to. So it's more referential.
Mm,
And by the way, it's sometimes a federated referential across an ecosystem. Maybe we'll go back to that later on with our also the agentic AI sometimes can help with this complex federated data sharing approach. Then you have other static information in terms of sourcing, supply chain sourcing, so raw material origin, mining, production location. So general information, supply chain sourcing, carbon footprint in static, in the sense that the carbon footprint of the batteries manufacturing and raw material sourcing. Then you have things dynamic, so the performance and durability. And we mentioned it before, like that we can also leverage to guide the consumer in extending the life cycle of the battery. So it's really like data on battery state of health, state of charge, expected service life. And then you have because the end goal of that also is circularity, so recyclability and end of life. So it's a bit static and dynamic, of course, because static in the sense that you need to have the detail on how to dispose of or recycle of the battery, but also post usage, let's say, information in terms of recycling and repurposing. And I know that the industry is organizing themselves because today I had a few numbers the other day. The number of battery we are collecting and recycling, repurposing is fairly small, if not negligible. Tomorrow, when you project. So you do high level. It's not a big piece of mathematics, but you just do like the volume of vehicle you will have with the fact that the life cycle of the first vehicle will run, it will be multiplied by 1,000. So you need actually to have a proper then a network to manage all that. So it's true that this last point in terms of dynamic and static data for recyclability and end of life will become more and more critical in the years to come.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing as well is, and again, that's again back to the data, right? Is it can be daunting for when when the list that you were sharing, whether it's static or dynamic. I think the good news of as companies are going through the exercise is that for some of it, companies already have it. So, when you were mentioning, for example, the product information or the general information like bill of materials, manufacturing records, all of that is typically held in a customer internal system like ERP, PLM. And so I think a big part of the effort is just identifying where is that data, kind of aggregating it, but especially with now new technology, it's getting easier and easier. I think one piece, and that's where again going back to what we see companies starting to do in terms of homework, that companies often don't have is more the piece you were talking about supply chain and sourcing. And so because that the source of that data, most companies don't currently have it in their system. Their suppliers have it. And so they need to collect information from their suppliers, tier one, tier two, and beyond. I think for what we're seeing right now, this is where there's the least maturity sometimes for company. This is the most critical and challenging data source in some ways. Company will need to collect the primary data from their upstream supply chain. That includes the raw material sourcing. You mentioned it, like information on the origin of minerals, especially cobalt, lithium, and nickel, including the mining location, and ethical sourcing verification. And I feel like for some companies, depending on where they are within the supply chain, you may have 5, 6, 7 tiers. That's why it can seem daunting, especially because again, we'll see with the implementation guidelines, but in EUBR, a lot of reference are made to chain of custody, which basically is a verifiable documentation tracking the materials and the components that they move through the mine to the battery manufacturers. This is what a lot of American company or people or companies doing business in the US are already doing a little bit for preparation for EU forced labor. But again, that's not necessarily something they've been doing around batteries. And I think that's why 2027 is going to come very fast. And so I would encourage anyone who has to comply with EU battery is already start having conversation with your suppliers, start to identify the end tiers, because it may take a minute, not, if you're talking OEMs, your suppliers are going to be quite mature. And on the IT side, if you start to go down the lines, refineries, mines, they don't always have very formal processes. And so being able to talk to them now to have all that information progressively in the next few months will be important so that you can fully scale and be fully ready for 2027. And I think that's the piece where I've seen different level of maturity, depending if we're talking to OEMs or energy company or battery manufacturers. We see a lot of variability in terms of understanding of that complexity. Again, the good news is most of the data that are related to your product, companies have it. And again, like being able to start collecting the data you don't have now will give you time, or will give companies time to be fully prepared. I just touched actually on the point that I wanted to get your perspective on, Paco, which is, again, if we're looking at electronic, if you're looking at OEMs, those are companies with pretty complex supply chain sometimes. And so in your experience, how can company with complex multi-tiered global supply chain effectively collect and verify all the required data that we just mentioned for the battery passports? What are some kind of best practices for engaging suppliers that may again, themselves have a different level of maturity.
Mm. Well, anyway, in today's world, most of businesses have complex value chain. It's true that unless we are buying an organic chicken from local market, but if not, even in CP, consumer good, and etc., very often it's composed of things which have done 3 times the around the globe. But so I will not answer straight away to the question, but I think first that there are some good practice to, let's say, facilitate this collaboration with suppliers simply by being to stay ahead of regulatory evolutions to anticipate things and not being like in panic mode last minute. Participate in value chain, ecosystem, and consortium, which are so critical in the case of battery passport. I will not name all the ecosystem consortium existing, but I'm sure that uh, you have some in mind, and it's really federated, especially in Europe, Americas, all OEMs, let's say more largely. Partner also with solution providers, Sourcemap and others, because it's important also it helps staying ahead of and interpreting what's going on. Let's say that is facilitator or enablers to have a good tier N suppliers management collaboration and be on top of it. Then after that, there's of course the classic change. There's the classic human collaboration with suppliers, but I don't want to sound too tech geek or tech oriented, but really, I think we are facing difficulties, which is it's extremely difficult. It's so complex, this value chain. Without technologic help, we fail. I mean, we would have like army of people calling and gathering data and etc. It's true that now what makes me a little bit hopeful is that there are some very elegant and innovative. It will sound a bit agent to agent, so with agentic AI, agent to agent, federated data sharing approach that we have particularly developed, for example, in with the consumer good forum, so more in CP. But it's very transposable to actually our case here. And with white room in between, completely agnostic technology wise to discuss between suppliers, OEMs, etc. White room to ensure data confidentiality. I really think that sometimes AI can be scary, but in that case, I think it can really unlock a lot of data continuity issues and engagement of suppliers because we will facilitate this collaboration.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we're really also seeing that, and again, learnings from other regulations or other projects are related to NTA mapping, the data sharing between suppliers and customers. Obviously, you will always have, which is the case, especially the more upstream you go, smaller suppliers that may not have a lot of technology access, or that don't know what an API is. And so having the flexibility to allow suppliers to share into the same information through multiple different avenues with their customers for us has been really an unlock in terms of response rates, especially if you're looking at big volumes where you need to have it for every orders, every product. And so on the source map side, obviously, there's a few, I think, technology piece that we've developed, whether it's an integration layer for suppliers, having a supplier portal that is available in multiple languages, because again, it's not all suppliers will speak English. Many suppliers on the manufacturing side are going to be in China or in Southeast Asia, where they will be more comfortable using the platform in their own language. So I think having this kind of option, manual, Excel, or an integration layers, allowing suppliers to kind of meet them where they are in their technology journey, but to share the same information has been very much an unlock. But I will also say that some of those best practices also needs to come from the top when companies are, asking their suppliers to do an effort. Part of our playbook at Sourcemap is someone, whether it's the CPO, the chief, purchasing officers, sourcing leaders need to send an official communication to their suppliers. It cannot be seen as just a little compliance efforts or sustainability efforts. It needs to be taken pretty seriously and come from the top as a way to communicate with suppliers. It also means educating your category manager, your purchasing team, so that they know, because the first thing a supplier will go is when they receive this communication is call the category manager and ask, do I really have to do it? And so your team needs to be educated as well. So it's a technology piece in terms of how can we automate as much as possible. And to your point with AI, with integration now, there is so much more potential to make everyone's life easier. And with those regulations, I think that's why on our side, we're really impatient for the implementation guidelines, because this will allow us to, and allow suppliers to basically really know what they have to provide very specifically in a certain formats. And so everyone does the same thing. But again, the maturity is as soon as you go N tier has been really what we've seen is sure your tier ones of an OEM will want an API, but as soon as you go to the intermediary, how do we make their life easier? Because again, for you, battery, they're a key stakeholder in this journey. And so it's been very interesting to have those conversations with suppliers. And again, as we said a little bit at the beginning, if you're looking at it as a way to also unlock potential for your sourcing, for your development of your companies, having interaction with those suppliers in an easy way is really also is going to unlock those strategic sourcing decision, being able to be in touch with a refinery that has very great practices or a lot of capacity can really turn how you're going to scale your business. But again, not want, and maybe my last point is I don't want to undermine the fact that this is going to be new for some suppliers. And so having kind of a communication plan for how you talk to your suppliers, whether they're your tier one or tier N, is very much key. The technology will help automate the coming from the top will make it seem serious, but having a communication plan, or we call that a playbook at Sourcemap, is really key. Again, otherwise you might not be able to scale and be ready by 2027. Thank you so much, Paco, for joining us and for this discussion. As I said earlier, it's a topic that we're seeing with a lot of growing interest, because I think people are starting to your point earlier, asking themselves questions, and the more they ask themselves questions, more questions come up. So very excited about what's to come and to continue perhaps to this conversation in the future.
Yeah, no, but thank you. It was my pleasure. And thanks to Sourcemap also to making, to try to upskill the community on these things. It's not easy. So it's greatly appreciated, I think, by all partners, including
Amazing.
Capgemini.
Thank you, Paco.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.